fine. We can be there. Yeah. And we are live. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SiMODiSA YouTube channel. I'm SiMODiSA. I'm from a wonderful organization called SiMODiSA, and we are an industry association, non-profit by nature. We're all about aggregating the ecosystem and creating an enabling environment for you, the entrepreneurs, to thrive. Well, this is the first SiMODiSA ecosystem dialogue, definitely not the last one. And we very much focused on having conversations that impact you as an entrepreneur in this country. That's why we launched the ecosystem dialogue. It's going to happen on a monthly basis, and these will be conversations around key, relevant, and important news around entrepreneurship. It's also important to be able to see the faces and the figures behind what's happening in entrepreneurship and the people that are investing in entrepreneurs, incubating, accelerating entrepreneurs. So we look forward to having you on a monthly basis joining into our ecosystem dialogues. This month, we have a very, very interesting topic. We're going to be talking and unpacking the Section 12J tax incentive for venture capital companies. This is the one tax incentive for high growth, high impact entrepreneurs in our country. And it is seemingly coming to an end, or it has come to an end. Today, we will be discussing what is it, how was it fundamental in getting entrepreneurship going, investing in entrepreneurs, growing startup, high growth, high impact startups in our country. And then we'll also reflect on what happened on the 24th of February, which is when we had the budget speech, and our Minister Tito Mboweni announced that the Section 12J sunset clause is not going to be extended post the 30th of June 2021. Now, the Section 12J incentive has been around since around 2008, and it was designed that by the year 2021, which is this year, they will review and revise whether it has actually achieved its objectives in our country. And so today, to speak to us about this wonderful, which it was wonderful when it was in place, to speak about it, to unpack it, to discuss what happened on the 24th and what it means to us entrepreneurs. I have Shelly Lotz. She's the head of regulatory affairs at SAFCA. And I also have Jeff Miller, who is the CEO of Growvest, but also part of the Section 12J organization in our country. And so I think to start off and kickstart our conversation, I'm going to ask yourselves to introduce yourselves and then talk to us about what role your organizations played in Section 12J. Shelly, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Maxi. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. So my name is Shelly Lotz, and I head up regulatory affairs at SAFCA, and that's the Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. And essentially what we did in terms of 12J is we had the initial discussions. I think a lot of people will claim that they were involved in those discussions, but we were part of those discussions with government initially to be able to motivate for more investments through venture capital, essentially, into high growth, high impact startups, and to really foster those kind of growth initiatives in government and to incentivize people to invest.
Thank you, Shelly. Jeff?
Thanks, Maxi. My name is Jeff Miller. I'm the CEO of Growvest. We were one of the pioneers, or the pioneers of Section 12J. We were the first operational Section 12J to hit the markets probably 8 years ago. We've obviously seen the market grow. It's become a real asset class with approximately 12 billion rand of assets under management at the moment. I also sit on the 12J Association of South Africa, where we're actively involved in lobbying government for an extension, which unfortunately wasn't accepted, and I'm sure we'll discuss the impact of that later. But, we've been very, very instrumental in Section 12J, building up the industry, to getting involved in, the Davis Tax Commission with a whole lot of changes, but unfortunately it's come to an end.
Very unfortunate. But before we go into the details of why we find ourselves where we are, I think, Shelly, to be lovely for you to describe what is Section 12J, and also why was it introduced?
So Section 12J is essentially a tax incentive. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to get investors to essentially take risk. And the way that the idea around the incentive was to get them to invest into startups and SMEs. We know that they really struggle for investments, and lack of capital is one of the big reasons why startups and SMEs really struggle and why they fail. So what government said is, okay, well, what we can try and do is to offer these investors a tax deduction or a tax break for their full initial investment price to incentivize them to actually take this risk and invest in these underlying companies to try and create the growth. So the idea is that obviously depending on who invests, whether you're an individual or a corporate, you get the tax deduction. So it's almost a risk sharing between the investor, because they will still lose money if the investment goes down to zero. But the idea is that the government is going to share the risk to essentially try and incentivize people to invest in these types of companies.
Thanks, Shelly, for that. And Jeff, being a venture capitalist yourself, please just describe what a venture capital company is. And also, leading on to that, was the Section 12J able to achieve its objectives?
So venture capital, by its nature, is investing in early stage type businesses who don't or can't get funding from traditional sources, such as the banks, and too small for private equity investments to have a look at. So they're somewhere in between. So you have your real angels who come in right in the beginning, and then you have probably the venture capitalists coming afterwards, who will obviously give some additional capital to stimulate their business, growth capital, etc., etc. Section 12J, in my opinion, played a huge role in building up the venture capital market, and in different areas. I think there's a whole lot of different mandates which different Section 12J funds took. They started off as general funds, and then they slowly migrated into specialist funds, whether it would be tech, whether it's solar, whether it would be agri. There's a whole lot of different. Hospitality was a big one, student accommodation was where people would, to look to. I think that we know for certain that certainly in hospitality assets, that we've approached the normal banks for funding or part funding, and they're just not looking at it. So I think if it wasn't for the Section 12J initiative, a whole lot of these hospitality assets, which are big drivers of job creation in South Africa. It's our second biggest export in GDP. It's probably around about 9 or 10% of GDP, would not, could not have been supported. I think that we know that, I think what Section 12J, or what the Treasury wanted, was mainly not asset-backed type investments, but essentially when working with third-party capital, which is retail money, or for people who invested into Section 12J, the fund managers wanted to have some sort of asset underpin in order to give those investors some sort of underlying, asset, so that their funds weren't entirely at risk.
Mm. So do you feel that, Jeff, it has achieved its objectives? In your opinion, as somebody who's been involved in the space for all these years?
Yeah, so I've been involved, like I said, we were, the first guys to get involved in Section 12J. I'm very, very disappointed with Treasury's decision to bring it to a halt, notwithstanding that it was always in the legislation that they would review it in June 21. But I personally thought that it would be extended because of the good work that it had been done. I think that in terms of jobs, it created a huge amount of jobs, 10,500 jobs at a cost per job of around about 30,000 Rand per job, which according to my research, is probably one of the lowest job creators that government have done. I think that they were creating legitimate businesses that, because of there was lots and lots of legislation, you had to be registered with the FSCA and SARS. So these companies were paying their VAT, that PAYE, dividends tax, company tax, and And we've learned from the UK, where in fact this regime was taken from, is to date that these VCTs, what's happening in the UK, are net taxpayers, and there's no VAT leakage. So I think it was still early stages for government or Treasury to pull the plug. I think they should have given it some more time, because I would say that Section 12J has only taken off in the last 5 years, albeit that the regime has been around for 12 years. We've only got the big money in the last 5 years, and it's still taking time to actually flow through the system in terms of being all the money being executed into projects. So a lot of money is still in the process of being executed as we speak.
Thanks for that, Jeff. As an organization that's been around for all these years and participating and seeing the impact, I'm sure it's something that did come as a disappointment from yourselves. And then, Shelley, in terms of your thoughts around, did it achieve its objectives? And are you surprised that the government has actually decided not to continue it?
So I think the government had always said that they would assess the sunset clause based on achieving the objectives. Now, for me, the interesting part was that you've obviously got the spirit of the legislation and what the government's intention was up front. You've got what the legislation actually says, and then you've got what was actually done. And essentially what National Treasury did is they went to all the BCCs and they said, let's do a survey. Can you tell me where the money went, what's still sitting there, how many jobs were created, etc. And essentially they got to the conclusion that it didn't achieve the objectives. And what they said was, of the 11 billion that they quoted that was invested in the 360 BCCs, only 37% had created jobs. Now, what they then intimated was obviously that the money wasn't going to where they had anticipated it would go, or where they actually wanted it to go. But that's not saying that that didn't meet the ambit of the legislation. So as Jeff said, there's a whole lot of things, and he's 100% right. It took a long time, one, for the incentive to take off, and two, to actually, it takes a while to create jobs, for example. And there were a couple of times where there was what people would term abuse. But what the legislation then did, or the National Treasury, they said, okay, we are eliminating that. And they made some pretty big changes to the legislation so that there couldn't be abuse in it. The likes of holiday homes and things like that, which actually came out. And then the industry carried on going forward. And I think where the industry felt that they got to was that they said, okay, now we are still investing as per your legislation in terms of what the legislation said. What the budget came out and said when they kind of put an explanatory memorandum as to why they were taking away, they said, well, they weren't taking the risks that they wanted it to. So that asset back that Jeff mentioned was not where the government essentially wanted it. It wanted to be into companies that there was no asset underpin to give them that risk mitigation. So from my perspective is that's all well and good, but then to just take away the whole incentive at all seems pretty broad brush and quite harsh, when actually there are at least 37% that are creating jobs, and maybe there was a way around it that didn't need to be so draconian.
And just to follow on that, was there clarity as to what kind of businesses should be invested in? Because I think that's where people have an idea that it's designed to go into high impact, high growth technology businesses. But if you look at where most of the money, or a lot of the money, has been channeled to, it's everything else but that. So what was the criteria to start off with?
So the criteria had to do with permissible trades, and the things like hospitality, renewable energy, leasing companies, they were essentially permissible trades. And where fund managers weren't entirely sure, they would actually approach SARS and say, well, is this right or isn't it right? And almost get an opinion to say that it does meet the remit. So I think that's 100% it. There's almost a mismatch between the spirit or the intention of what either people believe or what the government believed versus potentially what was actually in the legislation. And the idea is that you can fix that by tweaking the legislation if it really was going to the wrong place and you didn't believe that that's where you wanted to go, rather than just getting rid of it altogether.
Brilliant. I think, Jeff, my question is around, my next question is around, is it really that difficult to invest in high growth, high impact businesses in South Africa?
So before we go back to that, Nancy, if you don't mind, I'd like to also just comment on the previous topic.
Yeah.
And, the Treasury came back and they said that the investments that currently the Section 12Js were making into could get funding from traditional sources. And I completely disagree with this statement. And this was in the budget commentary, because we know for certain that we've approached banks for a whole lot of different, opportunities, and they're just not looking. And you have to give security. There is no track record, and so I think that was an incorrect statement. In terms of saying that they're also investing in low risk assets. I mean, hospitality, I don't ever think that when the Section 12K came out that they would be thinking that they would be building huge hotels. But in hindsight, by default, that in fact has been the biggest job creator, has been the hospitality industry. Also, I'd like to, as a result of COVID, I'll challenge anyone to tell me that hospitality is a low risk industry. In fact, it's probably one of the hardest hit as a result of COVID. We've seen there's no international travel. We saw the other day what it's done to the fiscus. And if it wasn't for Section 12J, I would believe that a lot of these hotels would already, not be existent or would have obviously been in liquidation. Mm. In terms of investing in high impact type businesses, I think we say that there was only to be invested in tech. I don't know if that was only the reason that it's only in tech businesses, because otherwise they would have made the definition only to be into tech businesses. That said, there are a number of tech businesses out there in Section 12J, but tech businesses by nature are not high capital type businesses, and they don't really generate lots and lots of jobs, especially in the initial phases when they are building out their technologies and having to grow markets. Only once it has caught on, can you then take that and get to scale. So I think what was important was that, what the intention was to actually back businesses that couldn't get funding from traditional sources. By giving the tax break, you effectively had a risk-adjusted return, and ultimately, in terms of the growth plan in South Africa, is to create jobs. I mean, we all know that how important it is that we have job creation in South Africa, because that is one of our biggest challenges that we have out there. We also know that the private sector is the biggest employer, and by creating these SMMEs, we could go on to, with growth capital, with equity risk, they could go on to employ additional parties or persons into their businesses and grow. So I think that overall, all businesses in the early stages is high risk, and by giving this incentive was an opportunity for investors to actually put their money and take a punt, because there was definitely a high degree of uncertainty as to whether these businesses could survive or not.
Interesting take on that. And now I think I'll just talk about the white elephant in the room, which is the abuse of this incentive. As much as we are lamenting and we're not happy and we're disappointed with the government deciding not to continue with the incentive, a lot of people do feel that it was to a large degree exploited. It was abused, and people, instead of investing in startups and small businesses in South Africa, they were in essence buying second holiday homes and investing in things that they shouldn't be investing in. What are your sentiments on that?
So firstly, Matthew, I don't think it's the elephant in the room.
Okay,
I really don't, because I think we as Grovest, we as a 12J association, and I'm sure I'll speak for Shelley as talking about SAFCA, is we're looking to create a credible industry. Okay, it's a new asset class that is starting to gain a lot of traction. Let's say 12 billion rand, and there were support services and fund managers and administration companies and auditors and secretarial companies, etc., etc. They were built around. So we certainly we did not want anyone to take advantage. Yet there were people who took advantage, and as Shelley mentioned, that the legislation was changed along the way to close these gaps, which we support, and we're very, very happy. I don't believe that the intention was ever that anyone should put a holiday home and get a 12J benefit on that. And I personally at GrowVest and the 12J Association would certainly not support that. And we're very, very glad that those things were closed down. But I think that what the guys did in the industry is they looked at the legislation and they worked within the framework of the legislation. And we believe that if government felt, or Treasury felt, that it wasn't achieving what it had to achieve, we should have sat around the table and we should have discussed what are the concerns, what are the challenges, where are the risk areas, and then together with the 12J Association, which is a credible organization, which is representing the big players in the industry, together with SAFCA, who also is a big player in private equity and venture capital, we would have worked with Treasury and government to come to some sort of understanding that was a win-win for all. But unfortunately, we never had that opportunity. Hopefully, maybe they will come with a new regime that is probably less complicated, that more focused, and that will support, because I think that is what's needed, to support the SMMEs and venture capital in South Africa.
Shelley, I think in your experience, or from what you've heard, what have been those abuse of this incentive? I mean, just create a not so nice picture about how people actually used to exploit this.
So we obviously don't see all of the transactions in the market, and they don't necessarily come across our desk. I think there's a couple of things that the fund managers probably could have done better. And that's not abuse, but that's just how you market the incentive, right? So the idea that actually it was save lots of tax, don't pay tax, and really they to get people to invest, they were doing it almost on the basis of the tax rather than the benefit to the economy or the benefit to the SMEs, and that's definitely not abuse per se. So I think for me there's ranges, because there was outright abuse, and the holiday homes I think is the key ones, where people had elaborate structures to try and get around the legislation where it was blatant and it was completely wrong, and actually those in theory could be challenged in court, right? So the idea is that SARS could have a look at them and they could challenge it in court, but I understand it's really difficult to do, so I don't know how many of those actually do. Then I think there's this mismatch between where people believe that the incentive was supposed to be, or the spirit of the incentive, the high growth high, and where the investment was actually going. So I think that's where the mismatch is. Now for me, it's actually not abuse necessarily, but it's how do you police what is the spirit? Because now you're guessing what you think the spirits of being, and we've had so many debates around what was the original intention, what is the spirit, where should the money have gone, and then you come up with one thing as to exactly your point. And see, that's what the view was, but then the legislation might not necessarily say that. So you're always going to have this mismatch between where the money actually went versus where people thought it should go, if that makes sense. And that's where but that's not actual abuse. That's maybe just structured around what the legislation says you're allowed to do, and that maybe wasn't the original intention.
So it seems like we were 10 steps ahead, now we're like 15 steps back, because we all know how difficult it is to fund early stage ventures. South Africa is one country that doesn't have enough capital to invest in ideas, and that's why it makes it difficult for us to grow high impact enterprises. And now what for the venture capital industry? If there's one thing that you, as let's say SAFCA, would advise the government, what would that be?
So I think it's almost time to regroup, right? So the idea is that we know that we need to invest in these high impacts and really like job creating and growth creating businesses. And really it is a little bit back to the drawing board, because so the problem that we've now created is that the incentive was fantastic at raising capital, which ultimately everybody's really struggled about. The venture capital industry wouldn't have had the growth that it had over the last couple of years without this incentive. It allowed some of the fund managers to continue on their trajectory. So it was really good in doing that. So, but the problem is investors can be fickle. You can't create an incentive and expect them to buy in, create this asset class, and then take it away. And then in a year or two's time, you want to come back to the table and go, here is the Section 12J BCC 2.0. Please believe us this time, and now we're actually going to do it indefinitely. Like, investors are going to struggle with this yes, no, maybe. And for me, that is very problematic. So we need to make sure that we can still attract the capital, and that the capital goes to whatever the right place is, and how that needs to be very, very specifically defined so that it actually can. And I think the problem in this country that we're having at the moment is that a lot of other jurisdictions are enticing people to start up their businesses elsewhere. And we need to try and keep those entrepreneurs on South African soil and to create the jobs here, because what we could be doing is missing out on the next growth story, and all those jobs are getting created in another jurisdiction that isn't South Africa. And that's the problem. And this trust deficit with us and the government, or in terms of trying to work out how best to do that, it is a little bit broken, because I think that everybody believes that somebody else should have been doing it or monitoring it, and somebody didn't play their part. But ultimately, unless we work together to actually get this right, it's a lose-lose for everybody, because entrepreneurs are going to leave, investors are not going to want to keep investing in this asset class, and you're going to lose out on growth jobs. So yeah, sit around the table and I guess start from scratch.
So we basically made South Africa very unattractive for investors and also for entrepreneurs to start their businesses. Jeff, what would be your advice to the government?
Well, firstly, number one, I think what Section 12J did is it kept a lot of money onshore. Now, so, you know, there's no secret that South Africa has its challenges, and that a lot of these investors, if it may not have been for Section 12J, may have been enticed to take their money offshore, you know, and invest, whether it was in foreign stocks or just take it offshore because it's much more safe. I think by now, getting rid of the Section 12J, the Treasury government run a huge risk of that money that would normally have been invested into 12J and being invested into South African companies and into job creation will now be taken offshore, and those opportunities will be lost. Maybe it would be used to fund some other foreign type of initiative, or put it into some safe haven. So, so for me, I think it's a huge, again, a huge disappointment for a number of reasons: job creation, money onshore, stimulus to the economy, that this was, was not extended. What do I hope that government will do? I hope that they will maybe say that, listen, 12J was a complex piece of legislation, which was panel beaten over the years, and maybe they say, listen, we need to scrap that piece of legislation and come back with a new piece of legislation that will hopefully be much easier to interpret, won't have, let's say we'll have borders that there's no misuse or abuse or taking advantage of, but that would still support the South African entrepreneur, that will still give the South African investor some sort of tax benefit because for the risk-adjusted return, and to obviously stop the monies going offshore. So maybe I'm being too much of an optimist, but I am an optimist by nature. But I just think this is what's required in our country. If you want to, we have a lot of talent over here. I can tell you the talent that we have is equal and better to that anywhere else in the world. But we need the foundations. We need the support. We need the money to give these guys a start. And Section 12J was a great start. It was a great foundation. and I'm hoping that it will be replaced.
Great. As we close the conversation, Sherry, as much as we are not happy with the government, because I think it's something that is really not progressing our objectives, progressing while we wake up and do what we do every morning, what can we as an industry do better to make sure that something of this sort doesn't happen? And perhaps also we are able to reinstate something similar but more refined.
Yeah, I think, especially in terms of the VCCs or the industry itself that invested the money, I guess from that perspective, you genuinely need to take a hard look at yourself and go, okay, we are not blameless in this whole situation. Like, I got emails every now and again, and I was like, yo, not so sure that this is the spirit. And I guess it's actually just putting yourself in the government's shoes to be able to say, what could we have done better? So yes, we're not there. We can't police what everybody does, but there were fund managers that took, that really did try and use it or structure around it or create something that really, hand on heart, they could not have ever said that was part of the intention. So I think as an industry that we're very quick to say there's a trust deficit with government, but at the same time, they probably feel that there's a bit of a trust deficit with us as well, because they don't believe that all the money went to where it should have, and maybe we should have done something earlier to fix it, if that's the case. And yeah, so I think there's a bit more introspection and kind of looking at yourself in the mirror to make sure that we can't just point fingers at other people and be able to say, if the survey had come back and there had been, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of jobs and all the money had gone where National Treasury intended, they would have never been able to have the ability to shut it down. So, whether you believe what they came back with, they did do a genuine survey to come back with it. So I think you can't lay the full blame, but at National Treasury's feet, but at the same time, it is really disappointing because there were other ways to deal with it that we could have ended up in a better situation rather than 10 steps back.
And then lastly for you, Sherry, what's next for SAPCA in this regard? What are you as an industry association that represents these venture capital companies going to do?
So I think it's back to the ecosystem and back to work out what do we need to be able to do to actually rebuild it. So, there really has been some positive and, investors have been willing to invest in this. And the idea is it's a rebuilding exercise, whether that is a startup act for South Africa, getting the rest of the ecosystem involved to be able to say, okay, well, how do we define startups? What do we think that needs to happen as an entire ecosystem, and maybe not just vested players one way or the other? And maybe we look at what needs to happen.
And Jeff, as the sun sets on the 30th of June 2021, as a venture capital company, what's next for you and your organization, also the Section 12J organization that you're representing?
So I think, look, the story is that the money invested up until the 30th of June still needs to be invested, still needs to be managed. We as GrowVest are an administration company. We manage or administer 40 odd Section 12Js to see that they're compliant. We help them with, the secretarial and corporate finance functions, accounting, legal, and we'll continue to do that. We, over and above that, we ourselves as GrowVest, we also do administration for private equity companies, companies who have to get outside, that need to get the licensing and to be registered with FSCA and all that type of stuff. So we will continue to focus more on the private equity side of things, especially with emerging fund managers who require assistance and can't afford the big guys out there. The GrowVest is out there to assist them. But I think more importantly, we will continue. We entrepreneurs, we will, we fall off the horse, we get back up, we dust ourselves off, we reinvent ourselves. I think we understand alternative asset classes. I think we've seen a big industry built. We've seen investors or thousands of investors invest into this asset class. And, who knows what's next, but, we continue. Life doesn't come to end. I think venture capital in South Africa, it will carry on, albeit maybe in a different form without the tax benefits. And we just hopefully that we can grow this industry because it deserves growing. I think there's talent out there that deserves backing, and we're going to have to create structures that does well for the entrepreneur and does well for the investor.
Brilliant. I think just to reflect on some of the questions that were asked by Guy Harris, a question on any chances of adapting the SEIS in UK for South Africa. So what does that mean, first of all, for those who don't understand?
Trying to remember, it's the Small Enterprises Incentive, I think, if I remember correctly, it's been a while. And I think it's so VCT is the equivalent of the VCC regime, so venture capital and trust versus venture capital company. And this is just a different incentive scheme in the UK. And I guess the same like anything, those incentives in the UK have been really, really good. Again, it's just targeting where it needs to go and how you measure it and how do you define those companies where that money needs to go. And I think the idea is that's a form of back to the drawing board to work out in South Africa, where does it need to go and can you adapt international legislation to be able to work in South Africa. I think one of the criticisms people have said that actually the VCT legislation in the UK goes to pages and pages and pages to be able to try and close off all those loopholes, whereas the VCC in South Africa was quite short, very specific, but quite difficult to navigate. So again, if there are lessons to be learned from international jurisdictions, we should definitely take them.
Jeff, what are your closing shots?
Look, my closing shots, I think I've said it a number of times.
Yeah.
How disappointed I am. It is what it is. We will work with SAFCA to lobby government for new incentives, to support SMMEs, venture capital, early stage private equity. We by nature, we're entrepreneurs. We'll reinvent ourselves. We'll pivot. We'll find solutions, and it's a new chapter. So I think after watch a space after 35 June. I think there'll be quite interesting new models that will be offered to the market, and some of them will be more popular than others, and we will adapt.
Thank you very much, Shaggy and Jeff, for your inputs on something that is quite important, investing in startups, investing in ideas in our country, because where else is our economy going to grow if it's not from those who are starting and coming up with ideas and starting businesses? I don't get a sense that this is the end. I have a feeling that it was a version 0.1, and let's do more, let's do better, let's work together between the public and the private sector and civil society organizations like ours to ensure that we are able to serve the needs of the startups, serve the needs of those who are contributing towards the economy. So for more information around the conversation that we had, please feel free to reach out to SAFCA, to Jeff's organization, which is the Section 12J Association of South Africa, and also to SiMODiSA, because this is something of interest to us as a non-profit organization that's dedicated towards creating an enabling environment for entrepreneurs. And on that note, I would like to thank you all for those who did tune in, and see you next month when we talk about something very interesting about entrepreneurship in our country. Have a wonderful evening ahead.